keep it honest. We keep it real. And I'm, of course, Anthony Parker Alexander. We thank you for watching the show. Don't forget to hit the like and share button and subscribe. Let's keep the show going. We try to do things with a Parker twist. We try to get the left side. We try to get the right side. And at the end, hopefully what you get is the truth. You may not like how that truth is, but we try to follow the truth. We try to put things in a Parker twist. Everybody, speaking of twist, we're talking about Dr. King. It's that time where it's the I Have a Dream speech, blacks and whites get together, hold hands, and then after that, it's gone. What is a Dr. King federal holiday? Well, we're going to put things in the King experience, and we're going to talk about things that maybe people don't talk about besides the March on Washington. On this show, very jam-packed show, we're going to talk about the March on Washington, but not just the I Have a Dream speech from what we heard and a little bit of backstory, but we're going to give you a backstory about what took place behind the scenes, behind all these people. We think of Dr. King as a kind of solemn kind of guy, very thoughtful. But we're going to talk about some of the things that, well, made him happy. And we're going to talk about Coretta Scott King and her influence, because behind every good woman or behind every good man is a great woman. We're going to talk about some things that you just don't know about King. We're going to talk about some things that were tragic even after he passed away. There's his mom, and there's the guy that killed his mom. It's a very sad story. We're going to talk about the good times from the Kings. We're going to talk about the bad times from the Kings. That's a hard picture to show, and we'll talk about that in a part of the show. March on Washington, Civil Rights Act, right there. John F. Kennedy. Was this a political ploy, or did he really care about African Americans and minorities? We're going to talk about that. Another iconic picture. So we could go so much on that story. But when we think of the pictures, we just think of the ones that stay in our face that we always remember. And we're going to try to lighten up some of the pictures. Let's think about this right here. Isn't that beautiful? The March on Washington. That's where that took place. It was also where the Obama inauguration took place. And I was at the inaugural, for the Obama inaugural. Blacks, whites, arm in arm, everybody hugging each other. It was about maybe 15 degrees in the cold. We had to be there 5 hours before Obama was inaugurated and became president. That feeling, I would love to see how many people were there. And that March on Washington. And then how many people were at the inaugural for Barack Obama? If you were at both of those, let me know. Email address is parkerman2011 at gmail.com. Excuse me, parkerman2011 at gmail.com. I have a couple of different email addresses. Telephone number, you can text me 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. So this is what I'm really excited about. So sit back, get some popcorn, and learn, because I have to learn. I'm putting all this easy for people, but it's in depth. So we're going to talk about some of the greatest speeches that weren't the Have a Dream speech. We're going to talk about the March on Washington and how, man, the government thought it was going to be a race riot. We're going to go behind the scenes on that. Bernice King. There's a story out now that somebody has kind of, in her eyes, degraded her when they said to a female, be like Coretta. How many books have Dr. King written? You love his speeches. Well, maybe it's time to read some of his books. What does Julia Roberts and the King family have? They have a weird connection. Speaking of connections, the sad connection of Dr. King and Malcolm X. They only met one time. One time they met, they could have changed the course of history. And facts and figures. I'm going to give you some facts about Dr. King that you may not even know. So stay tuned for that. And then some of the speeches, like I said, we're going to talk about that. But let's go. I think a lot of people, maybe some do, maybe some don't. The I Have a Dream speech was improvised. So halfway through his speech in 1963, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson shouted, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And that call out prompted him to say, "Hey, you know what? I'm going to get rid of this previous sermon that I was going to deliver. I'm going to do my Have a Dream speech that I've done a couple times, but not really to a whole lot of people." And when he improvised and did that, he taught his whole speech, did that, bam, the rest is history. Another fun fact, his name, birth name, was Michael King. When born on January 15th, 1929, he was named after his father, Michael King. But 6 years later, King's father visited Germany and learned about Martin Luther, the leader of the Protestant Reformation. He was said to have been so inspired that he returned home and officially changed both his and his eldest son's names to Martin Luther King. Wow. So it was Martin Luther for 6 years, or Michael King for 6 years, and then he changed his name to Martin Luther. Well, the dad did. So for 6 years, he was Martin Luther or Michael King. And after his 6th birthday, he became Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King Jr. Wow. How many people knew that? So, you have any questions or comments? You know how to contact me. So we have these speeches too about Dr. King that he did that wasn't a I Have a Dream speech. And here is one before we take a break. This is called A Time to Break the Silence. And this sermon was delivered at Riverside Church in New York on April 4th, 1967. Why is this speech important? Now, this was King's most controversial speech ever. Even some members of his own group warned him not to do it. With this sermon, King decisively came out against the Vietnam War at a time when many Americans still supported it. Now, why did he do that? People were furious. President Johnson stopped talking to him. Civil rights leaders criticized him, and major newspapers told him to stick to civil rights. Yet King put principle over personal popularity, and he continued to oppose the war. 1 year later, to the day that he gave the speech, he was assassinated in Memphis. So what he said about in his speech, money that should have been spent on Johnson's war on poverty was being lost in Vietnam's killing fields. Dr. King said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. So the speech distilled King's belief that racism, economic exploitation, and war were all connected as triple evils. The signature lines out of that speech. We are taking a Black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to even seat them together in the same schools. Wow. Some people said that that speech was too radical. But we're going to talk about some of his greatest speeches too throughout the show. So sit back, relax, and enjoy, because you are about to experience the King experience. And we'll be right back after this. don't just keep it honest, we keep it real. And you are watching the Dr. King Experience. Why we decided to call it like that different title, because these clips, these episodes, we're going to experience things dealing with Dr. King that maybe people may not have talked about. So everybody knows this scene where he did his Dr. King I Have a Dream speech. We know about the speech. We know how many people attended it, but we don't know the behind the scenes of what took place to make this happen. Amazing story. I'm going to tell you about it. So put your head back, close your eyes, and listen as we tell you the behind the scenes of the I Have a Dream speech. But first, if you have any questions or comments, you can give yours truly a call, 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. And you can email me. It's parkerman2011@gmail.com, parkerman2011@gmail.com. So let's go back to this, 1963. Great event. The I Have a Dream speech. But how was it behind the scenes of this iconic picture? We remember the speech, the huge numbers, and the peaceful protest. Yet behind the scenes, the famous March on Washington in 1963, it provided suspicion, anxiety, and deep-seated fears in the White House that the day would end in violence. People thought this day was going to end in violence. So go back. Across America, Black fury had broken loose. Protests, racial shifts in Birmingham, Alabama, where police dogs, and if you've seen those pictures, they were crazy, had torn at the flesh of protesters. And they also had fire hoses on these people. So between May and late August in 63, there had been over 1,300 demonstrations in more than 200 cities. Some were communities long splintered along racial lines. Others had never before been touched by violence. They had never seen this before. The randomness of the disturbance made it all the more terrifying. People were scared. Now, with over 200,000 protesters about to go to the nation's capital, there were fears that Washington itself could witness the same chaos and disorder. So for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the untitled leader back then of the civil rights movement, the events of the early summer had transformed the struggle for Black equality from what he called a Negro protest into a Negro revolution. America, he felt, had reached explosive points. So you have African Americans feeling that they're not getting the rights, they're tired. And there's fighting between blacks and whites, blacks getting hosed down, arrested, demonstrations across the country. And now they're taking their way to Washington at the monument. So of course, the country was scared. Back then, the president of the United States was Kennedy. So issues which are not settled by justice and fair play will sooner or later be affected or settled by force and violence. This was Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was, as Vice President, had a different take on African Americans back then. The accelerated tempo of Negro restiveness, he warned, and this was the Black advisor, Lewis Martin, may create the most critical state of race relations since the Civil War. Listen how scary this is. Negroes are now just antagonistic and mad, and they're going to be mad at everything. You can't talk to them, he said. My friends all say, even the Negro maids and servants are getting antagonistic. Wow. So like I said, John F. Kennedy was president back then. So for most of his presidency, he had viewed civil rights as a political issue to manage rather than a moral question to champion. Some people thought that he was for African Americans, but back then it says that it was a political thing for him. To take on the South was to risk splintering the Democratic Party, then an angry group of Northern liberals who tried to straddle the divide. Nor did Kennedy, who was a cool kind of guy, He was famed or known for his cool detachment. He had a strong emotional commitment to the freedom rights struggle. So was it a commitment or was it a political thing? So now let's go to the summer of 63. Kennedy realized that his presidency might come to be divided by his responses to the racial crisis. And he was saying to himself, I have got to get involved. In June, the fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. So, do we have any of that now? But what did we have to go through to get to where we're at now? So now, a couple days, right when the march on Washington, this is the plan. To get protesters off the streets, he had finally introduced a long-awaited civil rights bill that would begin to dismantle segregation, the system of racial apartheid that prevailed across much of the American South. Great time around us. But even after he had made his nationwide address and finally lent the weight of his office to the Black struggle, the protests and violence continued. So it's not stopped, it's not slowing up. A massive demonstration in Washington then was fraught with danger. When the administration learned midway through June of plans for the March on Washington, its first response was to pressure Black leaders into canceling. Hey guys, we think there's going to be a lot of stuff happening. Maybe you guys shouldn't do it. So at a White House meeting, Kennedy told Dr. King and other civil rights leaders that he did not want a big show on the Capitol because it would complicate efforts to enact the Civil Rights Bill into law. When attempts at persuasion failed, the administration decided instead to try to wrest control of the demonstration. Here, the president was adamant, shockingly so. They're liable to come down here and crap all over the Washington Monument, he told aides. I've got a civil rights bill to get through. We'll run it. So the bill was trying to get through as they were about to do this March on Washington. So to prevent the demonstration turning into a massive race riot, Kennedy ordered a mobilization of the federal government security apparatus unprecedented outside of wartime. Take this in. To start with, the FBI ramped up its already vast surveillance operation on the civil rights movement, which included electronic eavesdropping on King. It instructed every field office across the country to provide intelligence on how many local Black activists planned to converge in Washington and whether they had any affiliation with communist organizations. Back then in the 60s, they were trying to prevent anything from happening. An additional fear was that Black radicals who had rejected the nonviolent tactics of the more moderate civil rights, and who would say Malcolm X back then, would hijack the march. Almost 150 FBI agents were assigned to mingle in the crowd, working in tandem with Secret Service agents. Others were stationed at rooftop observation points. Now look at that, okay? Rooftop observation points on the Lincoln Memorial, Union Station, and the Commerce Department overlooking the mall. At the FBI headquarters, who director then was J. Edgar Hoover, and we know how bad he was, look it up. He feared might come under attack from protesters, and security was also tightened. Staff were warned to sit away from the windows. Wow. So now let's go to what happened a couple weeks before this took place. The prospect of violence also preoccupied the Washington Police Department, which was placed on the highest state of alert. It came up with no less than 72 potential disaster scenarios and plotted a response to each one. Wow. And here we go, a close-up. So look at that. What did they have to do to make sure this was a peaceful protest? And in the end, it was a peaceful protest. So it helped that the Lincoln Memorial was enclosed on three sides of water, okay? That way nobody can get around and try to do anything. But every corner of downtown Washington would also be protected. On Capitol Hill, a thin blue line of officers standing 5 feet apart would surround Congress. Wow. So a policeman or National Guardsman would be stationed on every corner in a downtown business district to guard against looting. To beef up the police presence, hundreds of additional officers were drafted in from neighboring suburban forces who attended specifically organized riot training courses. They were really getting prepared for this. So many law enforcement resources were devoted to policing the march, the FBI feared a spate of bank robberies in the capital's outlying neighborhoods. So they thought since all the cops were converging here, there were going to be crimes across the city. None of that happened. Despite the massive mobilization, police dogs remained in their kennels. Mindful of the ugly images from Birmingham in May, where the photographs of young protesters being mauled by snaring dogs had shocked so many white Americans, their presence could easily incite a crowd. And you think of how blessed everybody was that nothing really took place. We kind of shrugged that off, March on Washington, as far as peaceful, but really what they had to do to make sure nothing happened. And in the end, nothing happened anyway. So because so many arrests were expected, a team of local judges were placed on round-the-clock standby in the city's courtrooms. At the District of Columbia's jailhouse, 350 inmates were evacuated to create space for disruptive protesters. Elective surgery in the greater Washington area was canceled so that more than 350 beds could be set aside for riot-related emergencies. And none of this happened. None of it happened. Look at this picture. Etch this into your mind. None of that happened. This happened, but none of the other stuff happened. Wow. The DC General Hospital even went as far as to activate its national disaster plan. Life in Washington was completely disrupted in the run-up to the march. And it may have been disrupted, but it still took place. And at the end of the day, was it better to be prepared than not? Because as you know, this is where I Have a Dream took place. Government officials were told to stay home, and there was a 24-hour ban on the sale of alcohol. Wow, the first time since Prohibition. So fears about the violent potential of the march also worried its organizers. They agreed to bring forward the start time so that protesters would not be left wandering the streets after dark. The original plan for a mass protest on the steps of the U.S. Congress was shelved. So they wanted this at the United States Congress building, which I think would not have had that full effect. Instead, they chose Lincoln Memorial, a more manageable and less politically sensitive site. And maybe that was their thing to place it there, because it's not a political thing. You place it in front of Congress building, it is. So even after weeks of planning, administrative officials could not rule out the threat of violence. So on March Day itself, the District of Columbia was placed under virtual martial law, with the president ordering the biggest peaceful military buildup in the United States history. Wow. Keep looking at this picture, keep listening to the words. And my camera, man, I think is so much into it that he's paying attention to the story. So on March Day itself, they had a virtual martial law. By mid-morning on August 28th, 5 military bases on the outskirts of the capital were bursting with activity as a heavily armed 4,000-strong task force with the code name Inside prepared for deployment. When they say pictures say 1,000 words, it says 1,000 words, but there were probably 1,000 people involved that weren't in this picture. So at Fort Myer, 30 helicopters had been flown in especially to provide a rapid shift capability, meaning those 30 helicopters would be there just like that. 15,000 Special Force troops were placed on standby, ready to be airlifted at the sign of trouble. If violence flared, speed of deployment was essential. Wow. If the violence continued, the president would sign an executive order authorizing the Pentagon to take all appropriate stages and steps to disperse the crowd. I wonder what that means. As a confidential memo put it, desire for use of minimum force must not jeopardize successful completion of mission. In response to an escalating situation, troops would first brandish unloaded rifles with bayonets, think about that, fixed Then, if it got worse, they would bear and show the bayonets. If that failed, tear gas could be used, and then loaded rifles with bayonets fixed. The mission went by the code name Operation Washington. So heavy was the military buildup that one reporter observed that the city was transformed from the capital of a nation at peace to a nation at war. So while you got all these people over here saying, I have a dream, out of the outskirts of the picture was President Kennedy and other people saying, okay, if this goes bad, so let's be prepared. So throughout that day on the March in Washington, President Kennedy, he was inside the White House chairing a meeting of foreign policy advisors on Vietnam. But you got all this happening in your city, right down the street, and you're doing something else. So ahead of the march, he had resisted demands from King and the other leaders of the so-called Big Six civil rights organizations for a presidential audience that morning, since he did not want to be identified too closely with a demonstration that might become violent. So he turned down the invitation from Dr. King and them because he didn't want to be one of the faces of this nonviolent protest. His advisors also warned that Black leaders would arrive at the White House with a list of unreasonable demands which the president would find impossible to meet. I wonder what would their demands have been if they left the Oval Office aggravated because they didn't get the demands. The whole tenor or tone of the demonstration could rapidly change. So maybe they shouldn't have got together, which they didn't. So much to the march organizers' disappointment, Kennedy, he also decided against sending protesters a presidential statement, fearing it would spark demonstrations against him on the mall. Because back then, race relations were pretty big. So if Kennedy would have supported this, then it might have looked bad for people who aren't really for civil rights laws. So instead, he agreed to host a delegation of Black leaders after the protest, hoping it would soften their rhetoric against him. So an administrative official was positioned to the right, okay, of the Lincoln Memorial with an automatic cutoff switch and a record turntable. And that's in case somebody says something in these speeches that wasn't that good. So he's got the whole world in his hands at this march. And even though it wasn't all King's march, it was all of the people that came there. So when you're there, and I'm curious for people that were there, did you know any of this took place? I know I didn't. So now let's go to close of the timing. At 1:40 p.m., West Wing aides wheeled a small television to the Oval Office, and Kennedy began to watch just as King was about to speak. Standing midway up the steps of the most magnificent pulpit that America could offer, the preacher looked out over a stirring audience of over 200,000 demonstrators stretching down from either sides of the mall. Wow. Thousands were stretched out on the grass, laying down, jammed elbow to elbow, while others waded deep in the water to escape the heat. Wow. So when I was there for the Obama event, I was somewhere around there. And even at the Obama presidency, it was pretty amazing. So you picture this, all these people, arm in arm, laying down, some in the water. So with Dr. King and the statue of Abraham Lincoln in the background, he started his speech. So as he was doing his speech, a lot of people weren't impressed with this. It was hot, speech wasn't going well, and who set them off? That really started the I Have a Dream speech. Famous gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson. As the speech was not going well, Mahalia said, tell them about the dream. So she shouted, referring to Dr. King's riff, where in some of the speeches he did a little bit of a Dr. I have a dream speech, and he told about the dream. And so when she said, tell him about the dream, he decided, okay, well, you know what? I guess they're not kind of feeling it, so I'm going to improvise. And he put aside his prepared notes and then started saying, I have a dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of his crowd, he shouted, his arm outstretched just like he said. Dream on, they said, dream on. And with all that enthusiasm and excitement, he started talking about, I have a dream, and went on. King asked the crowd to yell so it was heard the world over. So watching in the White House, like so many Americans, President Kennedy looked at this 34-year-old preacher deliver a speech to the country the first time he had taken his measure. And he thought about it, and he said, wow, man, this guy's amazing. He is really good. The aide was struck, however, that the president seemed impressed more by the quality of King's speech than what it talked about. So happily, the march proved anticlimactic. By dusk, there had been just 3 arrests. Think about that, all those people, 3 arrests, all involving white people. In the event, the only threat to police came not from unruly protesters, but the chicken box dinners handed out earlier in the morning. And the funny thing was, they said, hey, they told the officers under no circumstances should they touch the chicken. Starts with a dream, ends with a chicken. Wow. And after that, President Kennedy invited them to the White House. I have a dream. Wow. So hopefully you learned something from this. I have a dream, Dr. King. Maybe you were there. And if you were there, and also if you were at the inauguration of President Obama, same place, March in Washington, let me know. Contact me. 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. Email address.